Hey, 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 number one Marmaduke fan here. I finished season 2 of Vox Machina. I promised an update video after I got caught up. So the lore is I did a spicy hot take video. I watched the first episode. I hated it. And so I kind of like threw out my hot take into the world because I was kind of interested to hear if anybody had an argument. I'm opinionated, but I'm okay being proven wrong or having an argument to change my opinion. And I also talked to my IRL friend, who's a big fan of Vox Machina. So what's kind of interesting is I'm sort of looking back on my first video and seeing if I can try to refine my argument a little bit more. And I actually kind of like the show much, much better now. So let me sum up what my hot take video was about. So I watched the very first episode and I hated it. Basically, I argued I thought Vox Machina was way too modern. It had sort of weird 21st century cultural pop culture references that feel completely out of place in a fantasy world. I thought it felt very cynical. You know, the heroism, that's just a big joke, ha ha ha. Sometimes I thought the characters' actions were so goofy it defied belief and took me out of the story. And I thought the character growth felt on the nose. So basically, what my friend and what the commenters argued is it gets much much better in season 3, in episode 3. I'm sorry, and you have to give the characters a little time to grow before you prejudge them. So what's kind of interesting about that is okay. So if you're telling me it gets better by episode 3, I can stick out that long. I don't consider that hate watching because I'm not forcing myself to watch something I'm hating. I'm watching a little more, anticipating this and they were right. I think there was a radical change starting in episode 3. It was sort of like the story found its legs. There was this whole like deep lore thing where apparently Critical Role had to kick someone out of their DM group, so they had to go back and rewrite some stuff. But whatever that is, basically the first 2 episodes kind of goofy, but set up some plot points we're going to need for later. So I survived the first 2 episodes. So what starts happening in episode 3? Let me before I get into that, let me tell you one more thing. My IRL friend Bacon Bravo said. I'll link to his channel. He streams. So his argument was, if you're interested in D&D as storytelling, you kind of just have to accept that D&D isn't like novel writing. Professor Tolkien was a nerd. When he writes a novel, he can meticulously craft every little piece of his world and spend 17 years doing it. The fun of D&D is the chaos of having a bunch of real people come together and you can't predict their actions. So if you're going to enjoy a story inspired by D&D, you kind of have to accept that chaotic element of real people acting weird and sort of building the story together. So I kind of said that was basically like a decision. If I'm going to watch a story inspired by D&D, I can't expect Tolkien. I have to let it be the thing it is. Let me say something about episode 2 I actually liked. So something I hated in episode 1 was they basically played this goofy song and they instantly got hired to kill the dragon. I thought, well, that's ridiculous. That's not a good reason for them to get hired. And they actually explained that in episode 2. It's revealed that a traitor who worked for the king wanted to hire them because he thought they were a bunch of idiots and they would distract everybody while he was building up his sinister plan. So what was seemingly an illogical, weird thing actually had a logical explanation. In episode 2, by the way, there's one scene I think I want to call attention to because I'm going to reference it later. So the evil general bad guy makes an epic speech about how they have to go out and fight this dragon. He's using all the classic, this is our duty kind of lines. And one of the guards says, that's a load of shite. And then they go out and they get murdered by the dragon. Later, it's revealed the evil general was the dragon in disguise. The whole speech was just an evil lie to manipulate the soldiers emotionally so he could destroy them and weaken the realm. So what episode 1 and 2 are doing is they're saying, this is a cynical world. You should be suspicious of the classic fantasy tropes of normal old school fantasy literature. Anyone could die. People who on the outside look like they could be this bold, brave, heroic knight. Inside, they might be a seditious traitor who are just lying to you. You should be suspicious. So with that in mind, let's start with episode 3. So starting in episode 3, this show has a lot less of what I hated and a lot more of what I liked. So one of the things I wanted was, okay, who is the character? So I get if it's an ensemble cast and all the characters are getting developed, but what's the thrust? What's motivating them as a group? So starting in episode 3, Percival basically becomes the protagonist. All the other characters get developed, but it's his backstory and his character arc that drives most of season one. He's very much like the hero with the thousand faces, all that kind of classical archetype stuff. He was the son of a lord. His family was murdered by the evil vampires, the briarwoods, and he's sworn revenge. He has a gun, and he's burned the names of those he's vowed to kill into it. He's possessed by a demon, and metaphorically, it's like he's being consumed by his desire for revenge, and he's literally being consumed by a demon that feeds on his thirst for revenge. Right, very much like Sunday Adakeda, very much like the Count of Monte Cristo, classic fantasy and revenge story tropes. Right, I love these tropes. Also, all I'm calling attention to right now is these are tried and true tropes. That's the hook. I also thought the D&D element felt much less obvious for the rest of season one. I kind of, in episodes 1 and 2, I just kept picturing the D&D table in my mind and thinking that's where they rolled the 1, that's where they rolled the 20. They did a much better job of making these feel like fantasy characters rather than making this feel like a D&D campaign that I'm just sitting and watching other people do. There are still a couple gags about D&D, but they're worked in a little bit more subtly, and it mostly becomes Scanlan who's the goofy comic relief for the rest of the series. He still makes some silly pop culture references from our world, the real world, that are kind of out of place, but he's the goofball instead of having the entire team be a whole bunch of goofballs. So I thought that helped. It helped to have the comic relief contained in one character. I also like that the comic relief was sparing. They're not ruining every emotional moment by just constantly throwing dumb jokes on you. Sometimes they're willing to let you be sad and let that moment linger. I have a friend, Pellegrini, who calls that jingling the keys. Like in Marvel movies, they can't let you be sad for 2 minutes without jingling the keys in front of you and telling you a stupid joke to ruin the moment. So Vox Machina thankfully avoids that problem. The fight choreography, I love that in episode 1 and 2, and it's consistently excellent throughout the entire series. I love how all the characters contribute to one another. They're all critical. If you take one character out, the whole team would die, basically. And that's really hard to write. So props for that. And what's neat about that is they actually have a central plot point relating to that. So one of the members of the group, Pike, their little holy gnome cleric, loses her connection to her holy magic. And so that means this team where they critically need everybody to work together, they've lost a very powerful and very critical part of their team. They have no healer, they have no holy magic, and they have to go fight a bunch of vampires. Great stuff. There is one scene in season 1 that I'm going to nitpick. So this is in episode 9. So one of my big problem with episodes 1 and 2 was this feels so cynical. This feels so modern. So I'm going to nitpick this scene in episode 9 because I think this is where they're sort of paying the price for that. So Percival's childhood buddy, Archie, he's the leader of the resistance trying to defeat the evil briarwoods, and Archie's killed in battle. So now Percival, he's been hesitant to, come back to his home and reclaim his rightful place as the Lord, right? He's hesitant to take on that responsibility. He's been content to let Archie lead things. Now that Archie's dead, Percival must become the hero of the hour and assume the role of leadership. So again, this is more classical hero's journey archetype stuff. He's hesitant to lead. He's ashamed of himself for running away. He's worried that his parents weren't perfect. He's worried he's just a spoiled rich kid. He was never meant to be the heir to the throne. His older brother was, but it's circumstances that are forcing him into the situation where he has to give an epic speech and rally the troops. Let me just tell you a couple examples of epic speeches I really like and have in mind. So I think Henry V, Shakespeare's play, has the excellent St. Crispin's Day heroic speech. That's kind of like the template of all great heroic speeches in movies. There's obviously Aragorn's speech in The Lord of the Rings. So those are speeches made by kings. But there are also great movie speeches made by common men. General Patton's speech, he's saying we're going to go through them like crap through a goose. He's speaking to blue-collar people. He's speaking at the level of common people. William Wallace's speech In Braveheart, he's making coarse jokes and getting him to laugh. So it actually doesn't matter if it's a heroic, inspiring king making it or kind of like a common, ordinary, everyday soldier. Anybody can make the big, epic, heroic speech. So what's my problem with Percival's speech? My problem is everything about the theming of this show has taught me to be cynical of heroic fantasy tropes like the epic speech. In fact, episode 2, there was literally an epic heroic speech that was a lie, and one of the soldiers in episode 2 called it a load of shite, right? So what I was expecting was, oh, this must be a setup for a gag. Percival's going to make his epic speech, and then an NPC is going to heckle him and say, screw you, you're not my boss, F this, I'm not getting eaten by zombies. But that didn't happen. Everybody loved the speech, they all shouted hurrah and ran into battle. So it's using the heroic battle speech uncynically, not as a joke. It's actually functioning the way a heroic speech is supposed to. It inspires everybody to go into battle. It's a heroic trope. And actually, I thought it was Percival made a pretty good speech. So I think every one of these speeches has to have two good things to work. Number one, it has to make an argument to people who are afraid of dying why it is worth dying to win in order to win this fight. This is something worth fighting for. And two, that argument has to be made by someone with charisma. And a king can have that charisma, a common soldier can have that charisma, but he has to speak it in a way that says, I too live up to this heroic ideal, so you can do it because I can do it. Follow me, basically. The right man for the hour has to make this speech. And so what's interesting about Percy is he's sort of like a king, and he's sort of like a commoner. He's literally the heir to a noble house, literally an heir to the throne, but he's lost everything and he's lived in poverty. His speech even has a great hook. He talks about how he's ashamed of himself for running away for the briarwoods, and now he's come back to fight them. But his rallying cry is, for Whitestone, for Whitestone. So here's my problem. We in the audience have seen Percy's heroic journey, but the villagers haven't. The reason why I thought, why doesn't someone cry out, screw this, I'm out of here, is because that we've done that before. It feels like the setup for a joke in a cynical take on fantasy. So this isn't just like a nitpick, but actually a constructive criticism. Something I think would have really helped this scene is, what if one of the villagers did heckle Percy and say, screw you, why should we follow you? And Percy came back with a logical shot or a funny joke to build his case. That's literally what William Wallace does in Braveheart. Someone makes fun of him and says, William Wallace is 7 feet tall, and Wallace turns that into a funny joke that makes everyone laugh. He charismatically uses the heckler to make his case even stronger, right? So basically, a heckler would have vocalized a cynical audience member in this scene, and it actually would have given Percy a chance to maybe show his persuasiveness. So the problem is, it's a pretty good little heroic speech, but the framing of the story is fighting with the themes of the story. Cynical framing, heroic themes. Which one wins out over which? So that was a criticism. Here's another aspect of season 1 that I really enjoyed, that I liked. There's this neat contrast between the briarwoods. They're these satanic vampires. They make a deal with a demonic entity type thing in exchange for prolonged life. And the occult is selfish. You give the devil everything, you destroy everyone in your path, and in the end, you get nothing in return. It's a correct use of the occult in a story if you want to make a moral point. You sacrifice everything to the devil's going to take everything away from you. This is contrasted with Pikes Journey, which is more like a religious awakening story. She's basically like a little paladin. She's afraid the vampires cursed her, and she's afraid that because of the vampires, she's lost her connection with her goddess. But of course, what she learns is nobody can sever your faith in God. Only if you have doubts, it's you who severs your faith in God. It's not other people. So she goes through this whole kind of like mystical religious experience where she encounters her goddess, the Everlight. And basically what I would describe the Everlight as a politically correct female version of the god of the Bible. So why do I say that? So Pike is like a paladin. And I know that not all paladins are Christians. I know that they worship all kinds of gods in D&D. But my point is, these characters, their aesthetics are like a European knight. So yeah, you can have a samurai paladin, you can have a paladin worshiping a pagan god, but the template of what a paladin is a King Arthur type knight, right? So, and Pike's story is paralleling a sort of Christian problem. What if I've lost my faith in my God? That's why it's resonant. She's sort of like a pastor's kid who's struggling with her sense of doubt and her sense of guilt, right? And her encounter with the Everlight is very reminiscent of biblical encounters with God. There's a bright light that's so bright and so dangerous and so holy. It's like it's dangerous to be even in the presence of it. It's like Moses on Mount Sinai. It's like one of the prophets seeing the freaky rings of fire and feeling like they're undone, right? It's like hot coals. It's too hot. It's too dangerous. So I think it's a really well written scene because the Everlight, this divine goddess, her message to Pike is basically to forcefully and authoritatively correct the error in Pike's thinking. Pike thinks she has to choose between being a follower of her religion and being with her friends, who are a bunch of drunken adventurers. And Pike feels guilty because she enjoys the company of these sinners. And the Everlight's message is: we don't make a choice; we walk down a path. It's a very poetic line. So, but the basic message is: you can serve God in any capacity. If you're a pastor's kid like Pike, you don't have to become a pastor. You can be a soldier or an adventurer and still serve the divine, right? So it's a really neat theme, and it's really resonant if you're a religious person because it connects to a real person's problem, right? But now here's the problem, though. The Everlight is also basically giving Pike permission to go get drunk and swear and carouse all she wants, right? So when Pike returns, she immediately starts dropping the F-bomb and cracking skulls again. So it's kind of a mixed message. What's interesting about a character like Pike is that she's part of a holy religious order similar to a Christian order of knights, yet she travels with a wild group of adventurers. If Pike's just one of the guys and gets drunk at all the parties, it's sort of taking away what's kind of special and interesting about that character is that she's the holy one. She's the religious one that's a part of this group. The theme is actually really good. The theme, the resonant part of the theme is it's possible to live a holy life in the midst of a sinful carnal world. But the takeaway for Pike is basically, who cares? Go ahead and be degenerate all you want, swear all you want. Don't worry about it. Don't be guilty, right? So that's why I say it's sort of like a politically correct version of it's similar to a biblical encounter, but the takeaway is a more politically correct version of that. Don't worry so much about being perfectly holy. And I actually think that Pike's relationship with Scanlan underscores the same theme. So this is kind of bringing in basically like what I call the modern versus classical approach to fantasy problem. Classical fantasy is very European, it's very British, it's very Christian. Most fantasy stories I've read are contrasting a Christian world and putting Christian themes and ideas into weird, sometimes pagan scenarios. I'm currently reading The Broken Sword, which is directly about that. So let's talk about Pike and Scanlan. So early on, it's hinted that Scanlan and Pike have a crush on one another, but Scanlan, the gnome bard, he's a sexual degenerate. He enjoys all kinds of debauchery. So he's a degenerate and she's a holy knight. So it's an unlikely pair. So here's my problem. What kind of rules do you think a strict religious order in a medieval world has for sex? If everybody's sexually libertine, then I expect there to be a world-building reason for that. Oh, well, we're cool with all kinds of sex because that's how we, serve the god Venus or whatever. Maybe they worship a sex goddess, and that's the explanation. But if it's similar to Europe, the kind of the pregnant question in my mind is always, well, gee, I wonder what the ancient order of religious knights, I wonder what their opinion on women in combat is. I wonder what their opinion on women pastors is, or what their opinion on sex before marriage is, right? So it's kind of like you can try to dodge that issue, but as long as you're dodging that issue, it's going to be a pregnant question. Do these ancient people have a 21st century worldview, or do they have a ancient medieval Christian style worldview? Where do I want to go with that? Okay, so here's what's kind of neat about Scanlan and Pike's story. It seems like Scanlan, the question is Scanlan's promiscuity supposed to be a charming trait? Maybe it makes him an admirable role model of pansexual, polyamorous identity. Or is Scanlan's promiscuity a deep character flaw he needs to overcome in order to become worthy of a woman like Pike? And there's some great character development where it's established that one of the reasons why Scanlan is so promiscuous is he feels unloved. So because he feels like no one loves him, he sleeps with everyone looking for love. So it seems like it could be Scanlan's on a character arc. Maybe he needs to repent of being a depraved degenerate so that he can be worthy of a woman like Pike. But it's a similar problem to Percival's speech. Are heroic speeches something we should look at with suspicion? Are heroic ideals something no one can live up to? Or are heroic speeches something that should speak to us and inspire us? Is Vox Machina, the story is kind of saying both at different points in the story. Is sexual debauchery fun and cool and liberating? Is marriage a confining institution that limits our libertine sexual freedom? Or is marriage a beautiful, divine institution that promotes true love and happiness? So for a relationship like Scanlan and Pike to work, either Scanlan has to give up his promiscuity and become a worthy gentleman for Pike, or Pike has to lower herself to Scanlan's level and join him in all the debauchery. Now, in a classical fantasy story, the ending to this story is obvious. It's Scanlan who has to change and become a gentleman, a man worthy of a pure woman. But is that the case for Vox Machina? I don't know, because the story hasn't ended. It's not resolved at the end of season 2. But if you believe that, if your view of sexuality is everything's fine as long as it's between two consenting adults, that's at odds with Scanlan going on a journey where he leaves behind his sexual debauchery to marry Pike and be faithful to Pike, right? You kind of got to pick one of those. And if he does that, that means you have to be critical of sexual debauchery. Maybe that's the direction they're going. That would be pretty based. That would be pretty based if that's the direction they're going. But I don't know. My take on most modern fantasy stories is when they try to deal with this stuff, they tend to take a safe approach where they basically just try to like stay hands off and not say anything about it. But it remains a pregnant question. I did watch season 2. I kind of got to the substance of what I wanted to talk about. So let me hear a few quick thoughts on season 2. I thought the character development for the rest of the cast was on point. We got to know everybody. We got to pay off the events of the first 2 episodes. So they kind of needed the first 2 episodes to set up things that happen in season 2. I still think the first 2 episodes could have been done better, but we definitely needed them to set up the events of season 2. It continues to have gorgeous animation, high stakes, well choreographed battles. A quibble is, I thought, Percival's character. He felt a bit nerfed compared to season 1. He was sort of the central character of season 1 and had a lot of cool moments. He doesn't get a lot of cool moments in season 2, so it's like, man, did he hit his head? Now that his character arc is done, now he's just an idiot who's along for the ride, I guess. But I also thought it was a little odd that a lot of the team problems are caused by a failure to communicate. There's actually a really cool scene in season 1 where, Percival's being grumpy and, he's sulking about his tragic backstory. And I think Pike's the one who says, let us help you. You need to tell us what's wrong so that we can help you. And then he kind of like says, oh yeah. And then he tells his backstory. So it's sort of like, instead of doing the stupid cliche movie plot where they just have someone sulking and not talking about the problem, they actually worked out the problem in a conversation, which is kind of cool. We don't always need a Disney style cliche movie plot to solve every group dynamic problem. But in season 2, there are lots of problems where I'm just thinking one 30-minute conversation would solve this problem. Saying 2 sentences, asking 1 question could solve this problem. And obviously it's going to build and build until the magic sword starts eating them up because Grog won't talk about it. That kind of stuff. So that was a little annoying, but not enough to break season 2. Basically, I've raised my score from a 1 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10. I initially hated the first episode. Now that I've watched the first 2 seasons, solid, enjoyable. Standard solid fantasy tropes. Nothing groundbreaking, nothing earth-shattering. I don't think it's fair to expect that, right? It's sort of like it's novelists who write, it's kind of, if you're going to write a novel, you better write something really creative, really different, really new that puts a twist on old cliches, right? That to make them feel fresh. For something like Vox Machina, I think it's fine for them to use these sort of solid classical archetypal type characters. I really enjoyed the feeling that this team has a dynamic. They're different, and the way their differences work together helps the team feel like a character. There were a few little annoying pop culture references, but they're very, very sparse. I thought the swearing and the violence, it's still R-rated, but it's more judiciously used than it was in the first two episodes. It was sort of everywhere in the first two episodes, and it's a bit more sprinkled in as needed from episode 3 on. I already had a chance to talk about the sort of modern fantasy versus classical fantasy problem. The basic problem is it's really hard to take a 21st secular worldview and make that work in a medieval, ancient world. Yeah, so those are my thoughts. Yeah, I don't think it's bad. I think my friend thought if you stick with it, the characters, you'll start to get a feel for the characters, and you'll start to warm up to the world, and that's exactly what happened. I'm still the type of guy who I'm kind of tired of modern stories, so I'm sort of at the point where okay, it's time for me to go read about hobbits and read a children's book from the 1800s because I'm tired of all of the modern 21st century cynicism. But if that kind of thing would bug you, then you might not like Vox Machina because it definitely has that modern element to it. But there is some good stuff there, and I can see why this became such a popular channel and such a popular series. And the animation, so gorgeous. Like, oh man, it's so beautiful, the animation. So that's my thoughts. Hope that gives you enough information to make an informed decision. What are your thoughts? Do you love this show? Spoil everything. I don't care about spoilers. If you have deep lore on Critical Role and all of their little channel episodes and stuff, feel free to spoil everything for me in the comments. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys. I'll catch you later.